And today we have Brian Cordes, who is the co-founder and National Programs Director for Neighborhood Cats, a leading community cat advocacy group with hands-on programs in New York City, New Jersey, and Maui. Currently, he and his wife, Susan Richmond, live in Hawaii and can usually be found trapping cats or releasing them after they've been neutered. In between stints with Neighborhood Cats, he served as a grants manager for PetSmart Charities, overseeing over $21 million in TNR and spay-neuter projects. He has produced many of the leading educational materials on trap, neuter, return, including award-winning books and videos, has assisted numerous communities in setting up large-scale TNR programs, and is a frequent presenter on community cat issues. Brian has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Cornell University and a JD from the University of California in Berkeley. Susan Richmond, who will be behind the scenes answering a lot of the questions today that you have with regards to Return to Field. She is the executive director of Neighborhood Cats, and she joined the organization after over 20 years of running a major New York City shelter and nonprofit veterinary clinic. At Neighborhood Cats, she has led multiple large targeted TNR projects in New York City and northern New Jersey, managed a program for providing scholarships to veterinarians for training in high volume spay neuter of community cats, and co-authored the Humane Society of the United States online course on TNR. In her spare time, she can often be found trapping feral cats on Maui. I'd also like to put a shout out today to Tomahawk Traps. They are at livetrap.com, www.livetrap.com. Tomahawk's mission is to aspire to exceed their customers' expectations by providing them with the highest quality humane animal control products available, and their friendly and knowledgeable professional staff will help inspire, educate, and problem solve for customers so they can effectively use their products. Tomahawk has kindly provided us with a code, which we'll put in the chat, DCNC20, and you can get 10% off an order of any of their trapping products there. So Tomahawk Trap is our sponsor today, and we're very thankful for their continued support of our educational programs.
Okay, thank you, Stacy, and thanks everybody for taking time out today to learn more about this exciting new program. We're going to be talking about, just like the title says, what is Return to Field, what are the policies behind it, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts. So I'm Brian Cordes. Stacy gave a great introduction, so I won't belabor that. And here is Susan Richmond. And as you can see, our knowledge of TNR and Return to Field comes from our own and our organizations and staffs and volunteers' direct experience. Before we get into the topic for today, just a quick note that in partnership with Community Cats Podcast, Neighborhood Cats is offering a TNR Certification Workshop. It's on the first Saturday of every month, unless that's a holiday weekend, in which case it's the second Saturday. Our next one will be on December 5th, coming up. It's 2.5 hours, but it goes by very quickly. It's quite comprehensive class. Lots of visuals, lots of videos, lots of Q&A. The basic idea is it's a basic training in trap, neuter, return with a focus on trapping, and then secondarily on colony management. So if you're interested in that, you can go to communitycatspodcast.com or click on the link on this slide to sign up. Also, as Stacy said, be sure to download the handout for the slides for today, so you don't have to worry about scribbling down links really quickly or any of the information you see. It's all right there on the PDF of the slides. The other handout is a guide on social distancing and trapping, which Neighborhood Cats co-authored with the Humane Society of the United States and Alley Cat Advocates. And we include that, even though it's a little off topic today, just because it's really important to be safe out there these days. You can do trapping in a way that is safe, and there's just some guidelines in that handout. Everything that you hear about today, you can dive into in more detail by getting the Return to Field Handbook, which was published by the Humane Society of the United States, and same characters involved in writing that, ourselves, Neighborhood Cats, Humane Society of the United States, and Alley Cat Advocates, which is a TNR organization based in Louisville, Kentucky. It won a award from the Cat Writers Association for Best Nonfiction Rescue, and it basically covers Return to Field in great detail, especially the nuts and bolts. There's lots of sample forms and sample ways of just going about doing it, and checklists and all sorts of stuff, so that you don't have to start from scratch if you decide you want to do this program. You can download a copy for free at the link there if you are somebody who likes to have a book in your hand. There are print copies available for purchase. Let's first talk about, when we talk about return to field, that's in relation to community cats. And so what is a community cat? I think it's important that we have the same thing in mind here. So community cats are basically cats that are free roaming, and they're unowned in the traditional sense. Somebody would not consider them their pets. Their socialization can range from very friendly, like completely tame cats, to being totally feral and everything in between. Most often, in my experience, community cats are part of a colony, and we define a colony as one or more community cats who share a common food source and territory. So that's what we're talking about. Now, what is return to field? So here's a real simple schematic. You've got a kitty up there on the upper left who's community cat out on Main Street. Somebody traps this kitty for whatever reason. They may think that they're helping the kitty. They may not like the kitty being around. They may not have thought it out. They just see a cat and they trap the cat. And what do? They take the cat to the shelter, as one would expect. Now, traditionally, going back before return to field programs began, if this kitty was feral, the shelter was the end of the line, because the kitty would not be adoptable, and there really would be nowhere to put the kitty. Maybe a barn cat program if you're lucky and there's one around, but most of the time that would be it. The cat would be euthanized. Now, if the cat was friendly and the shelter had space, which could be a big if, then the cat might go on an adoption track. If there was no room in the shelter and it was very crowded and there was no adoption available, then friendly or feral, that cat would be euthanized. So with return to field, instead of euthanasia, we continue down this path where the cat is brought to a spay-neuter clinic and fixed, given overnight to recover, and then, as you can see, transported back to Main Street, where the cat originally came from. Now he's ear-tipped and he's fixed, and he's released and put right back where he came from. Where did a return to field come from? I think the history of it is kind of interesting, so just wanted to share that with you. It started in Jacksonville in 2008. So, you know, in terms of animal welfare, this is a very new program. So First Coast No More Homeless Pets is a high volume spay-neuter clinic based in Jacksonville. And actually what happened was I was touring for the Humane Society of the United States, doing these 2-day presentations on trap, neuter, return. And I gave one in Jacksonville. And one of the questions that came up was, well, how do we get support for trap, neuter, return in the community? And I suggested that they approach their local animal control agency and ask them if the shelter would return ear-tipped cats to them so that these cats could go back to their colonies, and this would help to build support in the community for trap, neuter, return. So Rick Descharme, who was the head of First Coast No More Homeless Pets, he met with the director of Jacksonville Animal Care and Protective Services and asked if they would turn over ear-tipped cats. So the director thought about it for a couple of days, and he came back and he said to Rick, you can have all the community cats, whether they're ear-tipped or not. You just have to fix them, and then you can return them back. Rick got a grant from Best Friends Animal Society, and the first return to field program in the country was launched. Well, this is what happened afterwards. And this is why this has become such a popular program now. Um, the bar to focus on in this graph is the red bar. That's cat euthanasia. So the program began in August of 2008. In 2007, which is the first full year before the Return to Field program began, you can see the numbers were really quite staggering in a really bad direction. So approximately 11,500 out of 13,500 cats being intaked by the shelter were being euthanized. The Return to Field program began in late 2008, and you can see that red bar year after year after year just dramatically going down. So what was 11,500 cats dying in the shelter in 2007, by 2014 was approximately 500. So well over a 90–95% reduction in euthanasia. You can also see a couple of other interesting things in this chart. You can see how the blue bar, which is cat intake, also gradually came down over time. As we'll talk about later in the presentation, that was not directly due to Return to Field, but it was influenced by it, because by leading the community in new ways to deal with community cats, the shelter basically encouraged the practice of TNR, and the number of cats going to First Coast No More Homeless Pets just for straight TNR dramatically increased over this time period. Targeting was also done of zip codes, and that helped drive the number of cats coming into the shelter down. And then as a result of that, you can see the green bar gradually going down over time too. So fewer and fewer cats had to be returned to field. So in 2009, the first full year of the program, you had about 5,000 cats being returned to field. And by 2013, that was down to a little over 3,000. So really a very successful program all around. So, why stop euthanizing? And let me just say as a quick aside, what we're going to do today is we're going to spend the first part of this presentation discussing the policies of Return to Field, and then we're going to spend the second half of the presentation going over the nuts and bolts of how to do it. So why stop euthanizing? Well, because historically what we've seen is that euthanasia as a kind of global policy for dealing with community cats doesn't result in improvement in really anything that is meaningful to shelters. So we don't see intake and euthanasia numbers going down. At best, they may stay steady. We don't see complaint calls going down because it's not impacting the population of community cats in any kind of meaningful way. Wildlife predation stays at whatever level it is. And basically the number of community cats is remaining the same, which is why you have a constant flow coming in. Euthanasia, on the other hand, even though it doesn't seem to have much in the way of benefit as an overall policy, it does have quite a few significant costs. So high stress is something that our field doesn't like to talk about too much, but the fact is that there's been a fair amount of research on the psychological impact on shelter workers of being constantly exposed to the euthanasia of healthy animals. And what that research has found is that these shelter staff have some of the highest rates of any field, including law enforcement and first responders, of psychological disabilities, including post-traumatic stress disorder, much higher than normal suicide rates, much higher than normal substance abuse rates. And it makes sense. People come into this field wanting to make a difference and to help animals. And then at their hands or to their eyes on a regular basis, perfectly healthy animals are dying every day. That creates just a tremendous amount of psychological stress. Of course, that results in high turnover of staff, fairly or most likely unfairly. The need for the shelter if that's their only policy and they're really left with no other options and this flood of cats keeps coming in, what are they supposed to do? But it still makes for a poor public image. So high euthanasia shelters tend to have be viewed poorly by the community that they're in, so they get fewer adoptions, they get less donations, things like that. So why doesn't lethal control work? Why all these high costs, but so few, if any, benefits? And these are just the bottom line reasons. You really, at this point in time, in most communities in the United States, except for some areas where they've really been at it with the TNR and now Return-to-Field for many years, where there actually are some places that have shortages of cats, believe it or not. I'm thinking New England, I'm thinking the Northwest of the United States. But in most places, there's too many cats and there's too few animal control resources to realistically go around and gather up enough of them to make a significant difference in their population. You also have people in the community, the caretakers, the feeders, who love the cats and do not cooperate with trying to remove them. You have what you've probably heard of, which is the vacuum effect. That basically is, there are cats in an area, say behind the supermarket, because there are resources there that can support them. There's food from the dumpsters, there's enough shelter, and if you take those cats away, but you don't take the dumpster away and you don't take the shelter away, you've just created a vacuum in the environment, an opportunity for the next couple of cats that come along to repopulate the area. And that is actually a phenomenon that generally happens pretty quickly. That's when you catch all the cats in the colony. Those of you who do TNR know that's not, to get 100% requires a fair amount of diligence, and usually animal control does not have the luxury of hanging out all day to catch that last cat. So they don't catch all of them if they even have the information about how many there are. And as a result, the cats that are left behind, well, if the dumpster behind the supermarket could support 20 cats, and now there's only 4, well, those 4 now have access to enough resources for 20 cats. So guess what? More of their kittens survive, more of their kittens grow up, more of their kittens repopulate until you're right back up to 20 cats again. So when we talk about putting the cats back instead, the first thing that comes to people's minds is, won't everybody just freak out? Aren't you setting yourself up for just an onslaught of complaints from the public, from your government officials, from everybody? That's everybody's fear who has not, who is considering starting a return to field program. And look, I think it's a legitimate fear. I mean, not legitimate in the sense that it's going to happen. But when you think about, you're sitting in the call center of an animal control agency or a public health department, or you're the shelter that's contracted to deal with nuisance complaints, what are you hearing all day from the public? You're hearing, if you're hearing anything, you're hearing people call up and say, this cat scratched my car, you gotta get rid of them. I can't use my backyard. My neighbor's, her front lawn is a mess because there's too many cats out there. And you're just hearing nothing but complaints and hostility towards community cats. What you're not, because those are the people who call. So, but what about the people who like the cats? Well, are they going to pick up the phone and say, I really enjoy having Fluffy come by once a day and I leave a little food for her and thank you so much for leaving her in the community? I mean, obviously not. You're not going to hear from people who like having the cats around or who are okay with that. You're only going to hear from the squeaky wheel. So your perspective is going to be that everybody hates the cats because that's all you're hearing. So we try to get behind that as a field by looking at surveys and polls and trying to dig into, what do people really think? So this was a 2007 survey that was commissioned by AlleyCat Allies. And I want to emphasize that commissioned by means that they paid for it, but the polling is done by like Harris Interactive. I forget the exact company, but they're independent, reputable polling and market research survey companies. So this was the question that was posed to people. If you saw a stray cat in your community and you only had two choices of action, you could leave the cat where it is outside or have the cat caught and euthanized. What would you consider to be the more humane option? And they were given three choices: leave the cat where it is, have the cat put down, or, I don't know, or I won't tell you. So the results, surprisingly, not maybe surprisingly, 81% said to leave the cat where the cat is. Only 14% of, I think it was a sample of over 1,200 people, said that the cat should be euthanized. And they also took this question, they altered it slightly as a follow-up, and they asked, well, what if you knew that the cat would only survive for 2 years if you left him outside and because he would get hit by a car? Then what would you consider to be more humane? And leave the cat where the cat is only dropped down to 72%. So this survey certainly strongly suggests that the vast majority of people would prefer to leave the cat in the environment, no matter the consequences, even if the cat has a short life, rather than bring the cat to the shelter and euthanize them. Another survey was done in 2014, commissioned by Best Friends Animal Society. This brought the question of trap, neuter, return directly into the poll. And the question was, if you had to choose among these three options for managing community cats, what would you choose? A would be basically trap, neuter, return. B would be euthanasia. And C would be do nothing, just leave the cats alone to fend for themselves. The results, 68% were in favor of doing trap, neuter, return. Let me see if I have the right number there. Yes, 68%. Only 24% were in favor of euthanasia. And if you add the 8% who said leave the cat alone, you've got 3/4 of people saying preferring a non-lethal approach. So these surveys would strongly suggest that actually the silent majority does not favor euthanizing cats. Now, it's not that surprising when you dig into the research and the data that these surveys are turning out as they have, and those are just two. There have been others and they've had similar results. This was a research project done by a professor at the Ohio State University, who surveyed Ohio adults, so people over 8 years of 18. It was a statewide survey. So almost half of participants said they saw free roaming cats in their neighborhoods on a daily or weekly basis, and 26% had fed a free roaming cat at some point during the prior year. And that's high compared to other studies, but lots of studies out there do show that, I think it was something like 12% of households in a Florida county fed free roaming cats, and the percentages generally range in the 10, 11% up to this one, which is 26%. So that's a huge part of the population that's actually feeding these cats on a regular basis. And that is reflected in these surveys that show people do not want them to be euthanized. Just an interesting aside, where the work needs to be done, and at least as of 2008, hopefully it's gotten a bit better. But the people who were feeding free roaming cats, the 26% of adults who were feeding it, only a quarter of those were actually bringing the cats to be spayed or neutered. So you had 26% of the population feeding cats, but only about 6 to 7% that were getting them spayed and neutered. So the conclusion you can, I think, reasonably draw from these surveys and this research is that return to field is actually aligned with the majority who favor live outcomes and who are perfectly fine with leaving community cats in their environment. And euthanasia is aligned with the minority, but the minority who complains and wants the cats removed. And they're the ones you're hearing from on a regular basis until you start to have a return to field program and the culture starts to change. So the big question that every shelter, every open admission shelter that is bringing in cats, and these cats are healthy, but they're not, for whatever reason, they're not adoptable, either for temperament or for lack of space. Whatever your policy is, you're making a decision, whether you want to or not, about which part of your community you're serving. And what I would encourage you to do is dive into this research, into these policy issues, and make a conscious decision. Are you going to serve the part of your population that wants the cats around and is perfectly fine with them, or are you going to serve the part of your population that wants you to be the dumping ground and make sure that these cats disappear? That's the choice that you have to make. So what are some of the common fears that, besides everybody freaking out, that programs tend to have, shelters tend to have when they're considering whether or not to take on a return to field program? Well, I found that the number one fear is that people will harm the cats, that somebody's bringing the cat in who didn't want the cat around. You're putting the cat right back. Now, aren't they going to get violent? Aren't they going to take things into their own hands? And potentially this could become an abuse situation. So nobody has seen that yet. There's been no hard evidence in the 12 years of this program's existence of a significant increase in abuse because the cats were returned. In Jacksonville, that very first program, they microchipped the first 6,000 cats that went through the program because they wanted to try to track whether this was a legitimate fear. They wanted to see whether they're going to see these cats, DOA on the road, or ending up in bad situations, or ending up on the other side of the county, or because they were abandoned, or things like that. And after 6,000 microchips, they stopped chipping the cats because they didn't see anything that supported the expense of continuing to do that. Other programs I've worked with have also chipped the cats, and we work with Neighborhood Cats is directly involved in 2 different return to field programs where the cats are microchipped as a matter of policy, and neither of these programs has seen any significant amount of abuse. Does it mean there's none? No, of course not. But most people are not going to, are law-abiding people who are not going to be cruel to animals. Another thing to consider is that the cats are fixed when they're being returned. So a lot of the problematic behavior that people didn't like is gone. They're not caterwauling in the middle of the night. They're not spraying the backyard so it smells so horrible. They're not roaming as much because now they're fixed. So they become less noticeable, less of a problem for most people. So another fear programs have is people will complain to government officials, right? They're used to dropping off the cats at the shelter and never thinking about it again until the next cat shows up, and then they drop that cat off at the shelter too, and so on and so on. Now all of a sudden, you're not there for them, and it could well be they don't have anywhere to bring the cats. And so they what do? They call up their city officials and they complain that you're not doing what you're supposed to do, and they, even if you're a private shelter, they think you're taxpayer funded, but even if you are a government shelter, even more so, you should be doing what they want. And the fact is they will. These people will complain. And that's why it's so important in the beginning of these programs to take preventative measures to inoculate yourself against this by educating your policy makers and letting them know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that you found, if you have, that a policy of euthanasia is ineffective and a waste of money and not helping to mitigate the situation at all, and you don't think taxpayer funds should be going into failed programs. On the other hand, you think this has a reasonable chance of success, and that's the direction you're going in. And even, I'm not saying go, unless you have to, go and ask for permission, but let them know what you're doing and why, and tell them undoubtedly they will hear from people who are used to the old ways and don't like the change. And that should significantly cut back on any repercussions from that. There's also fear expressed that if you're doing a return to field program, ideally your ideal TNR RTF program is getting the cats in on Monday, the cat gets fixed on Tuesday, the cat is back home on Wednesday. So cycling through your shelter very quickly. Won't that mean that cat owners, if this is a pet, won't have a chance to come to your shelter to reclaim their pet to see if they've been turned in? Well, the reality is that only about 2% of pet cats or cats that are turned into shelters are reclaimed. It's really, there's all sorts of reasons for that. People are used to their cats being gone for a few days if they leave them outside. They may post flyers in the neighborhood, but maybe they don't even know where the shelter is, or it doesn't occur to them to check there. Whatever the reason, people don't generally go to shelters to try to find their cats. And if you put that cat back where he was trapped, he probably has a much better chance of returning home than otherwise. So what are some of the benefits to this program? Well, obviously, you're going to have less euthanasia if these are cats that otherwise would have no live outcome. That can free up resources for other programs. Euthanizing cats is, in many jurisdictions, is an expensive proposition. There are mandatory holding times. There is the cost of, if you're sending animal control officers to do the trapping, then that's their time, their fuel. The cat, while at the shelter, has to be cared for. There's staff time, there's resources, there's the euthanasia procedure, there's the disposal of the body. So this can cost anywhere, low end that I've heard is maybe $60 per cat. High end in your more crowded urban areas could be double that. And you multiply that by a few thousand cats a year, and that's quite a bit of money that could be going to TNR. It could be going to dog behavior programs. It could be going to any number of programs that will make a significant difference instead of into a program that just kind of keeps treading water. You get a healthier shelter environment for a couple of reasons. One is typically these cats, as we'll talk about, are housed separately from the general shelter population. So you're not introducing disease. You also are having less crowding, which is also going to prevent disease. We've seen public support for shelters that switch from a high euthanasia to a high live release rate significantly increase. People start to give money. They start to feel more comfortable coming to the shelter to adopt. There's culture change, both inside and outside the shelter. Outside the shelter, basically, euthanasia as a policy is a reactive program. It's the community dumping its problem on you as the shelter, and then you have to do something about it. You've got this live body, you have this cat in your hands, and you have no choice. You have to do something. So you're reacting to these cats being brought to you. When you're doing return to field, you're taking a proactive approach. You're saying, hey, community, spay neuter is the way to go. This is how we're going to solve our community's community cat problem or overpopulation. We're going to do it through spay neuter. We're going to do it through TNR. We're going to fix these cats, but we are not going to be your dumping ground and make them magically go away and absorb all the costs for that. And over time, as we saw in Jacksonville, once the county shelter started doing return to field, the volume of just pure TNR surgeries where the cats never interacted with the shelter, it went from 500 the year before the program began to several years later, it was over 11,000 a year. So the shelters becomes a leader. It starts to change the culture, which doesn't happen overnight, but it happens over the course of several years, where people look at community cats and their first thought is not, I got to trap that cat and bring them to the shelter. Their first thought is, where do I get them fixed? The culture change inside the shelter is also something that really can't be understated. I personally experienced shelter staff who were responsible for euthanizing community cats. And then all of a sudden the model switched. And there was one staff person in Albuquerque who, was the lead euthanasia tech. And when the Return to Field program began, she asked if she could come to one of the releases. And of course the answer was yes. She came, and when the cat was let go, she just burst out in tears. And she was so happy that that was one less life that she had to end. And that is just a very, very powerful thing. I've seen animal control officers when I was with PetSmart Charities. We did a grant to one city where the city was too big, even for like a $750,000 grant. So we had to divide the city in half and do the return to field program in one half, not in the other. So if the cats came from the right half, the RTF half of the city, they would get fixed and they would get put back. The euthanasia policy still stood for the cats who came in from the other half of the city. So the animal control officers at the shelter were very uncomfortable with this. They considered it quite arbitrary that this cat lived or this cat died, depending on their zip code of origin. Well, they went out and got their own grant to pay for all the cats to be spay neutered. And then on their own time, they took the cats back and returned them to field. So that's the kind of culture change you can see when you shift from into a life-saving model. Now, also another thing to keep in mind as a benefit to return to field is that we really don't know when you're euthanizing large numbers of cats coming in. It's impossible to tell how many of those cats are actually someone's pet if they're not wearing any identification, if they don't have a microchip. We know that people let their cats outside. We know that many, if not most of these cats do not have identification. We also know that when a cat comes to a shelter for the first time, they're usually totally freaked out and they may well present as feral. And it's not unless you let a day or two or three or a week go by before they get comfortable and they start to show their true personality. But usually shelters don't have the luxury of waiting to find out. They have to make these decisions about outcomes very quickly. So how many of these strays that we're euthanizing are really someone's pets? We don't know that, but when you're doing a return to field program, you're eliminating that risk. Okay, so at this point, Stacy, we can take about, I'd say 5 to 10 minutes of questions because that concludes the policy part of our presentation.
Excellent. Great. We've had quite a few questions come in. I've got a long list here. Um, so just going back to the very beginning, talking about return to field, and you've talked about the history of sort of how it got developed, but just to reiterate, to clarify, just so we have our language straight, we have return to field, we have trap, neuter, return, and then there's also something called SNR. And so is there a way to succinctly define how are they all specifically different from one another?
Yeah, excellent question. So first thing to understand is SNR, which stands for Shelter Neuter Return, is the exact same program as Return to Field. It's just a different name that when this program first began, it was actually called Feral Freedom. That's what Jacksonville called it. Feral Freedom became Shelter Neuter Return, became Return to Field, which is the dominant language that's used now. But Feral Freedom, Shelter Neuter Return, Return to Field are all names for the exact same thing. Now, the difference between Return to Field and Trap Neuter Return, there are two main differences. The number one difference is the intent of the trapper. So with Return to Field, you have people are capturing the cats, intending to bring the cats to the shelter and leave them there and never see the cat again. With Trap Neuter Return, the intent of the trapper is to get the cat to a spay neuter clinic, get him fixed, and bring him back. So the intent at the time of capture is very, very different. The other significant difference is that with Trap Neuter Return, generally, unless the shelter has a clinic, a separate spay neuter clinic, there's no interaction with the shelter. The cats that go through TNR are usually not impounded at the shelter, and the shelter is not the one deciding on the outcome of the cat. The people who have trapped the cat and bring the cat to the clinic are the ones who are deciding what's going to happen, and that's usually either adoption if that's possible or returning to the colony. With Return to Field, people are bringing the cats to the shelter, the cats are being impounded, and then it's the shelter that is deciding what the cat's outcome is. So both of them involve cats being captured, cats being fixed, and cats going back to their territories. But the huge difference is that with Return to Field, it's the shelter that decides what the outcome is going to be.
Excellent. All right. Another question that I've gotten to is, so if we have the organization, the shelter doing return to field, what sort of information is that communicating? And you went through a list of a couple of points of, what the community thinks about this. Are we encouraging folks that it's okay to just put cats out? Are we being irresponsible? Or is this actually helping us help those cats more in the community? I'm not sure if I'm phrasing that correctly, but it's sort of, are we creating a bad behavior by encouraging this?
I mean, yeah, excellent question. A couple of things. One is, be sure to go to animalsheltering.org and download the Return to Field Handbook, because there's a whole section on messaging, both messaging to the community and within the shelter. But I would say, no, I think that you're not sending out a bad message. The message that primarily you're sending out is that number one, these cats' lives have value. Just because somebody is displeased by seeing a cat go by doesn't mean that their lives end because of that. They have value, they deserve to live if they're not causing any significant dangers. And the other thing, that the message that you're sending is that if you are having issues with community cats, and a lot of places, a lot of people have it's important to understand that they have legitimate complaints. People who are having problems with community cats are not making it up. You know, if you live on a city block and there's 3 cats running around every night, fighting and caterwauling and waking you up at 4 a.m. every morning, that's a real problem. If you can't use your backyard because it smells so bad from a tomcat marking it, those are legitimate problems. And by doing return to field, the message you're sending to the community is this is how you solve that problem. You don't solve that problem by trapping those 3 cats, dropping them off at the shelter, we euthanize them. 6 months later, you bring us 3 more in this, and so on and so on. That's not a permanent solution. If you really want these problems to go away, we need to fix the cats. We need to deal with them responsibly. So I don't think that the message is these cats have, we're encouraging bad behavior. Those cats are already outside. You know, the bad behavior came from where did these cats originate? Way back when, who abandoned them, or who put a litter of kittens outside, or whatever it was, and that's where the bad actors are. And we need to address that as a field more, which is the origin of community cats. But treating them with spay neuter and valuing their lives and showing the community what a real solution is, I think that's a positive message.
Great. One person was asking a question about, why are there a lower number of cats in the northern part of the country versus the southern? Is it because there's more progressive spay neuter programs, or is it because we have winters and that helps reduce the cat population? And then also to add to that, do you believe in doing return to field in the wintertime?
Well, to answer the wintertime question, yes. As we'll see in the second part of this presentation, every cat deserves to be assessed individually. And the number one thing you're looking at is the cat healthy? Does he have a good coat? Is he good body weight? Are his eyes clear? And if a healthy cat, and there are other indications we'll talk about that you look at to determine is this a community cat, but if you are fairly comfortable that this is a community cat and he comes in the middle of January in perfect shape, well, he's doing quite well for himself. He's got food, he's got shelter. You may not be able to identify it specifically, but if they come in the middle of January in freezing temperatures in great shape, well, they're going to do just fine when you put them back, most likely. So yeah, I mean, obviously, if it's, you got a 10 degree below zero snap, you might want to hold on to the cats for a couple of days. But generally, Return to Field is a program that continues year round. I'm sorry, what was the first part of that question? I got lost in the second part.
Yeah, the reduction in the number of cats in the north, is it due to advanced spay neuter programs or the fact that we have winters?
Well, the birth rate for cats in this is a bit of a misconception out there that the cats in warmer climates give birth more often. Actually, the studies show that the peaks of pregnancies is exactly the same year wherever you live. That it has to do with the length of the amount of daylight is what triggers estrous cycles in cats, and pregnancies peak in Hawaii at the same time they peak in Canada. So what it is, the reason you have more cats in the south is because more of them survive. If their kittens are born in the middle of winter in Florida, they have a much better chance of surviving than if they're born in a more frigid climate. But the other reason I think, and probably the bigger one, is that TNR and spay neuter and the real advancement of these in a big high volume way has been practiced the most strenuous and the longest in New England and in the Northwest, and they are now reaping the benefits of this. And that's why in Hawaii, just a week ago, the Hawaiian shelters loaded up a giant jet that was paid for by Greater Good and shipped hundreds, I think 600 or 700 dogs and cats to the Northwest because they have a shortage and we have an overpopulation. But they have stuck with TNR and they have stuck with spay neuter longer than anyone. And as a result, they don't have as many animals. Okay, so let's talk about the flow. And when we get to surgery, we'll talk a little bit about the difficulty of finding surgeries right now. So this is what we're going to talk about. This is basically the nuts and bolts of a return to field program and how from beginning to return. So the first step is going to be at intake and gathering information, as much information as you can about that cat at the time of surrender. Usually at the same time, you're talking about return to field with the finders, and finder is a term that is describes the person who is surrendering the cat, the community cat. So once the cat is in the shelter's possession, then you're assessing eligibility. Should this cat be returned to field? If the answer is yes, then you have to house the cat. Then you need to get the cat into surgery. Then after recovery, the cat is returned. And then what you do post-return is another question to consider as part of your program. So let's go to the first step, which is information gathering. And I want to emphasize that this is really a critical part of the return to field process because this is where you can get the most information. It can be very, sometimes you can call up later and gather some more information from the finder. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes they're not reachable or they don't return your call or for whatever reason, you can't gather any more. So it's at that moment when the person is there in front of you that you want to do your best to get as much information as possible. And this information is going to be really helpful in deciding what to do, whether to return the cat or not being the crucial question, but also about how to do the return. Do you do it discreetly? Do you call them up and let them know the cat's coming back? It all depends on the information you gather. So these are some of the highlights. The Return to Field Handbook has sample interviews. It has a whole chapter on gathering information. So I would encourage you to get that book and look at that section to get more details about this. So these are the highlights. So these are the things you really want to set up your interview form. Sometimes you can have the person fill it out. It's usually better to have an admissions person ask the questions so that they can ask follow-ups if something's not clear. So location of origin is obviously the most important. You can't return a cat if you don't know where the cat came from. 2 points to make about that. Sometimes there's confusion. The finder will give you his address, his home address, but the trapping took place somewhere else, maybe where he works. So you probably want to have a follow-up question, is this where you live? Is this where you trap the cat? To make sure that the address you're given is the correct one. Now, the other thing that we encourage organizations to do is while you're there and the person's right in front of you, do a quick search on Google Maps to see if that address exists, because it's a lot harder to get that address later if it doesn't. And sometimes people will use addresses that are well known kind of colloquially in the local neighborhood, but are not official addresses, and you can't find them. Sometimes you'll enter an address. Now here's something to be wary of when you use Google Maps. If the address doesn't exist, Google Maps will not say to you the address doesn't exist. It will put the pin in the middle of nowhere. So if it puts the pin in the middle of an intersection, or if it puts it in the middle of the woods where there's no houses nearby, that's its way of telling you it's a bad address. So it takes 10 seconds, if you have the Google Maps up on your screen, to enter the address, make sure that it exists so that you can clarify. Now, the next thing is to get the cat's history. This will help you determine, was this cat recently abandoned and not really a community cat, or is this cat somebody who's been in the neighborhood for a while? So Did the cat recently arrive? Have you seen the cat before? How long have you seen it? Is the cat looking ill? Sometimes people bring in cats because they think they're sick. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Also, what is their behavior in the field? Do they run away? So a good question can be, how did you capture the cat? Oh boy, that's a good one, just because it's amazing what people can do. You know, we spend a lot of time teaching people how to trap and stuff like that. And a lot of these finders, you know, catch them in a laundry basket or, shutting the door of the carrier behind them. Of course, we don't see all the ones that don't succeed, but it is amazing how innovative people can be when it comes to catching cats. But if you had to trap a cat, that's a pretty good sign that in their own, if you have to trap in their own territory, that may be difficult to adopt this cat out. So all of these things will tell you about the cat. Also, the cat circumstances. Is the finder also the feeder, or does the finder know whether other people in the neighborhood are feeding? Are there other cats in the area? That can be very helpful. If this is just the only cat who just suddenly appeared out of nowhere, or are there community cats all over the place there? Is there construction going on? Is there something dangerous in the territory that you should know about? Ask the finder why they're bringing the cat in, because sometimes there's an assumption that, well, they're bringing the cat in because they don't like the cat, or they don't want the cat, or they're hostile. Well, in reality, that is certainly a substantial percentage. But people bring in cats for all sorts of reasons. One is they may bring the cat in because they love the cat, but they can't handle any more litters of kittens, and they don't know about spay neuter, or they don't know that there are affordable services available. Sometimes they think that, like I said, they think the cat is sick. Sometimes they think every cat that's brought in finds a home. There could be any number of reasons, and you want to find out about that. You also, during the interview, want to assess, what's the finder's attitude? Are they hostile or friendly? And to what degree? Is this somebody who, a lot of people will make threats and they're not getting what they want, but usually it's not serious. But every once in a while, you might get somebody who really is scary, and you want to know that when you're deciding what to do with the cat. So talking return to field with the finder, with the person who brought the cat in. Well, the first decision you're going to have to make is, are you going to talk about it or not? Now, in Jacksonville, when they first started, they did tell the finders that the cat was probably going to come back, and they found they spent a lot of time arguing with people, and that it was pretty much a waste of time. So they stopped talking about it. Other programs that I've worked with do openly discuss it nonetheless, and they have not had that kind of, once in a while somebody gets upset, doesn't like it, but a lot of times people are fine with it, and they give more information and they bring more cats in to get fixed. So it's really a decision you have to make. One option, if you're not wanting to spend time during admissions talking about it, is to just put that return to field as one of the, if somebody surrenders the cat, at that point, the shelter is the one who gets to decide what the outcome is. And if you want to, you could put in there that one of the options is fixing the cat and returning them. Another good reason to talk to finders, though, is, as I say, you can divert them into TNR programs. You can sometimes, it's not the majority, but it's still a significant number of people who will, once they understand the process and they realize, like, oh, the cat can be fixed and the problems I'm concerned about will go away, they're happy to come and pick the cat back up. And all of a sudden, you don't have a return to field. You have a trap neuter return instead. And again, they may borrow traps to bring more cats in to get fixed, things like that. Another thing you can do while you're having this discussion is complaint mitigation. Talk to them about common deterrents like motion-activated sprinklers or cat scat mats or things like that, which can solve the problems they may have with the cats in their backyard or digging in their garden or things like that. Okay, so then we get to, you've got the cat, you've gathered all this information. Now you have to assess eligibility for the Return to Field program. So first decision is who decides. You could have the decision made at the point of admission. So there's a lot of efficiency, kind of administrative efficiency in doing that. But it's a trade-off, and there's no right or wrong answer here. So if you have admissions doing it, the process is streamlined. The cat's brought in, the information's gathered, the person doing the admissions makes the decision which path this cat's going to go down. The only problem is that you may have, your admissions people may not be as knowledgeable as other people in your organization about community cats, especially if you have like a community cat coordinator. So what some programs do is they don't make the return to field decision until that specially assigned staff has a chance to look everything over and make that call. So that's one of the roles we play at Neighborhood Cats, and one of the return to field programs we work with is that all the information is presented to us and we get input from the shelter, but ultimately based on our experience, with working with community cats, we decide whether or not we're going to take that cat transferred to us for a return to field. You could also take a team approach, which is a number of people, the veterinarian, the community cat coordinator, admissions, they all have input into what the decision should be. Of course, the problem with that may be the best in terms of, analyzing all the facts and getting all the different possibilities discussed, but it can be the most inefficient, take the most time to do. So there's no right or wrong here. It's really a matter of what works best for your program. All right, so what are some of the factors to take into account when you're talking about the cat, him or herself? So like I mentioned before, the first thing you're looking at, is this a healthy cat? If this is a cat that's coming in grossly underweight and sick, and then this is not a cat who was thriving in his environment, and it's not a good idea to put him back there where he could do even worse. On the other hand, if the cat's doing great, and there are indications are that this is a community cat, then that makes it a lot easier to decide to put them back. Disability, is the cat declawed? Does the cat have blind? We've seen, and those are not necessarily automatic rule outs, but they kind of weigh pretty heavily against it unless the cat's living in very secure and protected circumstances. Age, a lot of programs don't return to field kittens below a certain age. Temperament, obviously, are they, if they're completely feral, then there's not a lot of choice. If they're healthy and they're feral, then back they go. The trickier thing comes when they're friendly, which we'll talk about a little bit. But also evaluate their behavior in the field. So if they're reported to be running up to their feeders and rubbing their legs out in the field, but in the shelter they're hiding in the back, and even after a few days they're acting very fearful, then this may be a community cat who's just very comfortable in their own territory, and that's but it's going to be hard to transfer them to someone else. Okay, looking at the location of origin. Again, you can see why it's so important to gather information in the beginning so that you can evaluate these things. Is it a really risky place? Are they knocking down every building on the block? You can't return a cat to that. On the other hand, maybe it's just a perfectly fine suburban neighborhood and there are no imminent changes that would cause a threat. Is there risk from the finder? Again, those of you who are experienced at shelters know that people who tend to talk a lot about threatening behavior are the ones who never do it. But sometimes there is a history there. Maybe there have been reports of abuse in that neighborhood, things like that. So what's the risk from that? What's the risk to wildlife? Is this cat was this cat brought to you from the middle of a bird sanctuary? Well, certainly you probably don't want to put the cat back in the middle of that sanctuary if the wildlife conservationists managing it don't want them there. What's the likelihood the cat is owned? Did they come in, with a collar on? Are there other indications from the information you gathered that makes you think this is probably an indoor-outdoor pet who needs to go back? And then what about, are there known caretakers, are there known feeders who will help who may be waiting for the cats to come back? So I mentioned friendly cats and kittens. So this is the part of Return to Field, which I personally feel has gone a little bit astray, if you'll pardon the pun. And that's, we see Return to Field programs, not all of them, but a lot of them. And there's some pretty powerful, well-known advocates of this approach, which is just if the cat came from outside, the cat automatically goes back outside. No questions asked. Friendliness is just, well, the cat's somebody's pet, or we know community cats can be friendly, whatever it is. If they came from outside, they're healthy, you put them back, no questions asked. We discourage that type of automated approach. Our feeling is that every cat should be individually assessed, because if you're experienced in this and you've worked with cats, you can often tell whether a cat is a friendly community cat who should go back, or whether they were just recently abandoned. So for example, during your interview, the finder tells you, well, I've never seen it. I take care of cats and I feed cats in my neighborhood. I've never seen this cat before. He's been sitting under a car for 3 days without moving. He will come up to me when I put food out and let me rub his head. All right, that's probably not a community cat, right? That's a cat who is lost or abandoned, and just because he came from outside and he's healthy doesn't mean he should go back in. So each cat should be individually assessed. Now, another factor to consider, of course, is the shelter's capacity for care. If there's no room, if it's the middle of kitten season and you've already got way more cats and kittens than you can manage, and there's a reasonable chance this cat will do okay if he's returned, that's an important factor. So we're not advocating that no friendly cats should go back outside. We think the shelter's capacity for care is an important part of that. But we have seen shelters that have plenty of capacity for care, but have sort of turned Return to Field into this ideological program where it doesn't matter. And if the cat's circumstances don't matter, he's healthy, he came from outside, he goes back outside. We want to avoid doing that. So the cat's history, community ties, we've seen friendly cats where they're really well loved by their community, where people have called up and objected to somebody having brought the cat in and they want the cat back. So that's a situation where putting a friendly cat back is pretty clear. So, treat each cat as the individual that he or she is, and given your capacity and the cat's information and the assessments you've made, try to make the best decision for the best available outcome for that cat. Okay, housing. Once the cat is in your system, ideally you want to keep the cat separate from the rest of the shelter environment, and away from barking dogs if that's at all possible. Your housing should be warm, dry, secure, so nobody but your shelter staff and people who are working on this program have access. Try to keep the housing convenient to either your on-campus clinic, or for picking up the cat and dropping them off at an outside clinic. Don't have your holding space where somebody has to walk up and down 4 flights of stairs in the middle of winter outdoors, something like that. This is the Maui Humane Society's holding space for community cats, and you can see that the cats are kept in their traps. We'll talk about that, covered with sheets. They're propped up on tables. The tables are lined with construction paper to absorb any waste. The floor can be hosed down pretty quickly. It's really quite a nice, it's separate from the rest of the shelter. So this would be sort of your ideal place to keep the cats. Now you can keep cats in traps, put them on tables like you saw in the last slide. Some shelters prefer to put the cats into cages, in which case you need to have feral cat dens. That's the square carrier that you see there. It has a porthole door on the side, which you can open and close without opening the cage door. So if the cat is feral, the cat runs into the den, you take a broomstick, you tip the side door shut, then you can open the door and clean. Basically, which one you choose may have something to do with the length of your stray hold. So if you don't have one for community cats, then probably just keeping them in the traps, having the traps double as cages is going to be a lot easier than having to deal with transferring cats in and out of cages. On the other hand, if you have a 7-day stray hold, maybe you're not, and you have the cages and you have the dens and people who are experienced with dealing with them, this may be a better option for you. So just to mention about stray holds, if you have one and it's causing a difficulty for your return to field program because you're not able to cycle the cats through as quickly as you'd like, they can be changed. And this is the state of Arizona revised their statutes so that the stray hold does not apply to return to field cats. And you can read the exact language here, but basically, if the cat fits the definition of eligible, so living outdoors, lacks discernible identification of sound health and possesses its claws, then the mandatory holding period is waived. So you may not be able to start off with that, but it's something that you can work towards. So caring for cats in traps. There's a couple of basic things that we recommend, that the traps be at least 30 inches in length and that they have a sliding rear door. You also need to have what are called trap dividers, and those are those pitchfork looking things you see in the middle of the trap there. And what you're doing is you're sectioning the cat off on one end of the trap so you can open the other end, line the floor with newspaper, put food and water in. If you do this twice a day, then the cats are kept fairly clean and pretty comfortable. You also need sheets to keep the cats covered. They feel more comfortable that way. If you'd like to see this in action, then click on this link, go to our website, follow that trail, and there's about a 3-minute video on how to take care of cats in traps. But basically what you're seeing in this photo, that's how you do it. You pull the sheet back, especially if they're feral, they'll prefer to be in the dark than in exposed, so they'll move back. You then put the trap dividers in, 2 of them, always 2. So that makes it pretty much, well, not pretty much, it makes it impossible for a cat to break out. Notice how the trap dividers are angled towards the cat, so he can't knock them and go under. Once he's sectioned off, you can open the front door and go ahead and clean and feed if you need to. Keeping track of the cats obviously is very important. This is one system that the Maui Humane Society has developed that they've kindly agreed to share with everybody. And you can see what they have plastic sleeves that are cable tied onto the front of the trap. And inside the sleeves is their paperwork. And this paperwork has a photo so that you can always match the cat to the cat's identification, and all the pertinent information is on this piece of paper, including the intake date, the location of origin, then you can see the intake evaluation, surgery date, and the other parts of this, approvals for release, the date released, things like that, as well as the microchip information. So everything's there. Once the cat is released, the final bits of paperwork are filled out, given to the community cat coordinator, and then all the information is entered into the system. So now we get to surgery, and on that concern that these days surgeries are hard to come by, that's absolutely true in many, many places. And I wish I had a good, easy answer for that. I don't. Uh, I guess that what you need to do is to, if you don't have any surgical capacity at all, then obviously there's just not a whole lot you can do. But if you have some, it may be a matter of trying to having priorities. So maybe you can't do TNR for the public and you have to save the surgeries for the cats in the shelter. Maybe some of the cats in the shelter are the younger ones that are below reproductive age. Maybe you can put those off for a couple of months and use your surgeries to save lives that otherwise will be lost if that surgery is not there. And certainly the return to field cats often qualify for that. If they can't get fixed, then they don't have a live outcome. So maybe that would help is to shift priorities and to make those tough choices on how you allocate. Look for new partnerships in some of the communities we work in. Some of the larger clinics have, for their safety of their staff, have dramatically cut back on their capacity, but we've been able to find some private veterinarians who will do it. It costs us more, but that's why we're here. We fundraise for that. So, if there's some capacity in the system, try to use it to save lives. So we've talked about timeliness. So the faster the cat cycles through, the less exposure of the rest of your shelter population to disease, the less stress on the cat, the sooner they get back into their familiar territory. So the faster you can get the cat through your system, the better. Standard treatment would be spay neuter, an ear tip, a rabies vaccine if that's required, optional services, FVRCP vaccine, parasite medications like for fleas. And if you're able, and it's really, admittedly most programs are not able, but if you can do basic dentals, treat injuries and illness. If not, it can be very helpful to have a partner that works with community cats who, I know at Neighborhood Cats, we often step in for cats at the local shelter where there aren't resources to do dentals, and we'll go raise the money and get the dental done. So it's helpful to have partners when you get to this point. Recovery time, the vast majority of RTF programs hold the cats overnight and release them the next day, absent some type of extenuating circumstances where the cat's having difficulty recovering from anesthesia, or it looks like there's excessive bleeding, or it was a very late term pregnancy, whatever it might be. But the vast majority of cats are held overnight and returned the next day. So who does the returns? Again, there's no right or wrong here, just a decision to make. Are you going to have shelter staff do it? Are you partnering with animal control officers who can return them? Do you have volunteers? Often programs partner with another group. So everything's done at the shelter, the cats are fixed, and then the partner group comes and the ownership is transferred to them and they go and drive the cats back. Your pre-return checklist, we recommend going through that. Going through this, you may develop your own, but there's some basic stuff you want to do before you put the cat in the transport vehicle. So medical approval, if this is possible, especially if the clinic is on campus for the shelter, to have a vet tech come by, take a real quick look, make sure that there's no problems, and sign off as approving the cat medically for release. Make sure you confirm the identification, look at the photo, make sure it's the same cat. Be very careful if you've got cats that look similar, like calicos, or you've got black cats, things like that. Check the photos, check the ID as closely as you can, especially if they're from different addresses. Also check that sometimes cats are considered adoption candidates, and then they're put on an adoption path, and it turns out that's not working out so well. So they're put back in the Return to Field program, and somebody forgot to take the collar off. So check to make sure there's no attached ID on the cat. As we mentioned before, it often takes cats a few days to calm down once they've been impounded. And if you have capacity and you're okay with putting friendly cats or kittens on an adoption track, take one last look before you put the cat in the car to see if they've mellowed out. Happens every now and then. You know, cats that were just hissing and spitting and totally acting feral, 3 days later, they're lying on their back wanting you to rub their belly. So just take a last look. Verify that you have a valid address. Look it up on Google Maps. You don't want to find out when you've got to the site that it doesn't exist. You can also at the same time scout the release site, and that's where Google Maps comes in, and that's what you see on this slide. If we were returning that cat to 272 Riverside Drive, we could zoom in there. We could look for, okay, what's the best exact spot to let this cat go? Should we let him go on at the pin? Should we go up a side street a little bit? You can even look in and see where there's access to alleys or backyards or things like that. So basically, you don't have to go drive to the spot and then start looking around. You can scout it on Google Maps and then go to the point of release. And then finally, make sure that the trap is locked or the den is secure before you lift it up. Things to think about when you're doing returns. How discreet do you want to be? That may have to do with, was the finder really hostile and really upset about this? Well, maybe you don't want to let the cat go right in his front yard. Maybe you want to go one block over if it's an adult cat. Most of the time it's fine and you're not going to have those problems, but it's just a decision to make. What's the weather? Is it really bad? Do you want to hold off? Do you want to do it at day or at night? If it's a busy commercial area, it's probably better to do the release at night when it's much quieter. How close do you need to get? And also, as I say, sometimes you want to call the people up. You want to let them know that, they want to know that the cat's coming back. They want to be present. They like the cats. Also to consider is public versus private property. You never want to step onto private property unless you have permission. Fastest way to get into trouble. So release the cats on the sidewalk, on the curb, in a near green area like a park, wherever it might be. But don't step onto someone's property. Kittens, a lot of it has to do with their age. If they're really young, you might not be able to return them unless the caretaker consents and is there. And because if you let them go, they won't recognize where they are. They only know the backyard, and you release them in the front, and they're completely lost. So, but if you get above you start getting 3 to 4 months old, and you can let them go in the front, they'll know to get to the back. Dealing with confrontation there's not very much of it, but if you do 500 returns, you're probably going to run into a couple of angry people along the way. And the thing about that is to just decide, don't wait until it happens and it catches you by surprise. Have a plan ahead of time that this is how we're going to handle angry situations. And the best way that we've learned to deal with it through experience is do not argue with somebody at the moment that they're angry. You can start to, if they're like, what are you doing? Why did you bring this cat back? You can begin to explain, but if you're getting a hostile vibe and they're not listening to you, then you want to hand them a brochure, tell them to call the shelter if they want more information, and then leave. On the other hand, if they're receptive, you can begin to talk about the policies and why this program is in place and things like that. But what you don't want to do is get into an argument, because that will just escalate and it won't help you or the cats. And you can avoid those type of confrontations. If you plan ahead of time, even do a little role playing, I would recommend, even if it's 5 minutes, because that training will kick in if this ever occurs. Okay, so before we move on to the next part, we've talked a lot about the nuts and bolts and the returns. Just wanted to show you just a little fun video that's a couple of minutes of actual returns, some of the more notable ones that we have done here.
Okay, buddy, you're home. You excited? Here you go. Okay, kitty, you're home. Gotta go.
Okay, there you go. So, in the end, that's what it's all about. You could see how incredibly happy they are to be back in their own home territory. So the last thing I want to cover briefly, and then we'll take questions, is the idea of population control when it comes to return to field, and combining that with trap, neuter, return, because we know with community cats, where there's one, there's probably a whole bunch more. So if the return to field cat is the only cat in the neighborhood, you've fixed him and you've put him back like this kitty here, well, you've got some population control, because he's the only cat and he can't reproduce if he happens to come upon another cat. But in the case where this cat is part of a 10-cat backyard colony, and the red circle means he's spay-neutered, you fix that one cat, well, there's 9 more that can continue to reproduce. You've really not done anything in terms of population control. Return to field is not a population control program. It's setting an example of how to solve nuisances and encouraging people to spay neuter in order to get to population control. But if you fix 1 out of 10 cats in an area, the cat population is not going to go down. When you look at it from a community point of view, this is what a return to field program, if that's all you're doing, this is what it looks like. You've got random cats throughout the community that have been returned, but in any one colony, you still have enough cats left that that population is unlikely to drop. So how do you solve that? Well, you can combine return to field with what's called colony level targeted TNR, which is that you're trying to get all the cats in the area fixed. So what some programs have done is this is what's called, they call the red flag approach. So the return to field cat is considered a red flag for that there are other cats in that neighborhood. So they return the cat and then they survey the neighborhood, and they go through, find out where the other cats are, trap them, and get them fixed as well. And then that particular colony of cats is no longer going to be a source of cats coming into the shelter. And if you look at that from a community view, that's what this looks like. So wherever a return to field cat is placed, there's been follow-up trapping, either through the program or through a partner group, that gets that particular colony under control. Another option besides colony level targeting is community level targeting. So instead of following up on individual colonies, the return to field cats are returned wherever they came from, but then high intake areas of the community, like in this one, zip code number 3, where there's a ton of community cats, that's where the targeted TNR takes place. So you're driving down the population in your your highest intake areas. So that's another way to combine return to field with TNR to get lower populations. The proof of the success of this approach comes from 6 shelters that did 3-year programs that partnered with Best Friends and were funded by PetSmart Charities while I was there. And you can see that the median drop in intake was 32% across all of these 6 different communities, and kitten intake down 40% and euthanasia down, as you would expect, quite a bit, 83%. So if you get that article down there on the bottom, it relates this data in more detail. But the bottom line is, when you combine return to field with a form of targeted TNR, you not only reduce euthanasia in the shelter, you reduce the number of cats coming in, and in that way, return to field becomes less and less necessary, or you have to do it with fewer and fewer cats. And here's a breakdown of one of those communities, which is Albuquerque. So 2010 was the year before any return to field was introduced, and you can see intake at close to 10,000 and euthanasia at about half that. The next year they introduced return to field, but did not introduce any type of targeted TNR. They only did return to field. So you could see that the red bar dropped by about the number of cats in 2011 that were returned to field, but intake did not go down. In 2012, the return to field program continued, but a targeted TNR element was added to it. And that's when you start to see not only euthanasia going down year after year, but intake dropping as well. So your most successful community cat programs are going to combine both. Now, often these programs, return to field programs, begin with return to field because that solves the immediate problem of this overwhelmed shelter with all these cats and these high euthanasia rates. But then a year or two in, the shelter starts to think about, well, why don't we get at the source of these return to field cats as well, now that we've got our own shelter under control. Okay, so we're at the point where we can take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I have a whole lineup of questions here for you, Brian.
Okay.
So we're going to bang through them very quickly here. One question is, one person's in a community where return to field is not mandatory. It is sort of done sort of halfway, and just wondering, if you have any recommendations for sort of how to convince them to really fully embrace return to field.
Well, I guess the first question I would have is, on what basis do they decide who gets returned, and on what basis how do they make that dividing line between who's returned and who doesn't? And if it's arbitrary, I would try to point that out to them. Also, they're not getting the full benefits of the program if they're only doing it for some cats and not others who would otherwise be eligible. And they're not teaching the community, to go all in on spay neuter. And they're kind of stuck in the middle of between euthanizing and kind of offering a menu of choices is not usually very good leadership. But you're welcome to write to me, Brian, B-R-Y-N, at neighborhoodcats.org, and tell me more about the specifics of your situation, and I could probably give you a better answer.
Great. A couple of housekeeping questions. The cage cards that Maui Humane Society that you were showing, is there a specific software that they use for those cage cards?
You know, right to Maui Humane Society, I'm not sure. There is, but I don't want to tell you the wrong answer. I'm not sure what the shelter software is for that.
Okay. Of course, this could merit its own webinar, but I don't know if you want to address any sort of organizations that are in an area where there's a large birding contingent, sort of like where you are living, and you know, how much time and effort should we be involved in that conversation, or should we just sort of put our heads down and do our work and hope by our actions that, you know, we'll be reducing the overall cat population so that maybe conflicts with birds and cats might be reduced that way?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you hate to paint everybody with the same brush. My experience with conservationists has been that they're very unhelpful and that I haven't been able to have a meaningful dialogue. So my advice is you want to make sure that the people who can have an influence, like your policymakers, your government officials, that they're educated about it and that they understand, even if they might not agree initially, that they understand what you're doing and they won't be surprised by it. But if you're looking for the approval of the conservationists, they're still stuck in like the cat's better off dead at the shelter than posing a threat to birds in the community, and they just not understanding that all you're doing is cycling through new cats. You're not lowering the cat population. You're just, you know, what I say is you have, you know, new furry faces, but not fewer. So, you know, what I found that is important for the TNR community and the Return to Field programs is be responsible on your own. Do not, if the cat is coming from the middle of a bird sanctuary where there are threatened birds and they're ground nesting and they would be easy for, you know, easy prey for a free roaming cat, you know, don't return a cat to there. You know, if you have to euthanize in that situation, then you have to. I mean, you're better off try to develop a barn program for those few exceptions, things like that. So be sensitive to wildlife concerns, but generally the conservationists will, they're at a point in their field where they're completely opposed to any cat in any circumstances being returned back outside. And it's generally a pretty fruitless conversation.
There are programs like the Cat Safe at Home program, which is in Portland, Oregon, and they do a lot of community outreach and education, and trying to at least get closer in that conversation and maybe not so polarized. And I'm not going to say it's, you know, perfect match, but yet I think that they are trying to work together. So there are some isolated areas where the conservationist crowds and feral cat groups can work together, but I would say that there are a few examples, not a lot of examples. And if you look at the United Kingdom, I just did an interview the other day with a woman in the United Kingdom, and they have a very different opinion with regards to cats and birds. So, you know, even looking globally might be helpful too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, go
it's,
ahead.
you know, it's always worth talking. You know, it's always worth trying to have a dialogue, but don't make the decision about whether to have this program dependent on it.
So if you are working for a no-kill organization rather than a municipal shelter or a high volume open admission shelter, and the community sort of reacts, well, why are you doing return to field if you're no kill? You know, there seems to be this a greater challenge from a no-kill perspective about how to communicate why return to field is beneficial if you do have capacity for care. So, you know, how do you educate the public for that kind of a program when you might have space in your organization to take those cats in?
Well, presumably you wouldn't return the cat unless you thought that was the best option for that cat. You know, unless you looked at all the information and you thought this cat's, you know, feral and is either going to be very difficult to place or is going to be very unhappy in an indoor situation, or perhaps you're concluding that this is actually somebody's indoor-outdoor pet. But for whatever reason, you've come to the conclusion that the best outcome for this cat is to go back to his or her neighborhood. Well, then your justification is you're doing the best thing for the cat.
Yep. And my last question just revolves around the fact, you had mentioned this earlier, but I think we need to re-stress it, that cats in shelters return to owners is a very low percentage. I believe it's like 2%, because we don't identify our cats well. We don't have them with tags, with collars, with microchips, with ear tips. And so, it's really important to identify the cats, but also realize that bringing cats into the shelter is not going to get that cat back home if it is a lost cat. I would assume you'd agree with that.
98% of the time. Yeah, it's very, we don't do a good job as a society of keeping track of our outdoor cats that are pets. People don't put collars on. If they do have collars, the collar doesn't have any information on it. People don't keep microchips if they have them up to date. So, it's very difficult from an animal welfare perspective I mean, we can absolutely do a better job of educating people and improving those numbers. But right now, it's pretty dismal, the reclaim rate.
Excellent. All right. We are at 4:02, so we are at the end of the webinar. I did put some announcements in the chat. If folks check out neighborhoodcats.org and communitycatspodcast.com for all of these resources we've been talking about today, and you can always feel free to email us if you have any questions. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank Kristen and Susie, who have been in the background handling all the questions. Brian, of course, a wonderful presentation, great videos, and hopefully we'll see a group of you on December 5th.